Hi, this is a very short run through of what we would look at in terms of environmental and planning designations, the research that we would do before submitting any planning application or talking further with our clients about proposals and what should form a planning application. So it's really a desktop check initially of planning and environmental constraints. And it begins with a look at policy designations. So we would have a thorough look at the local plan for the area and what the policy stated in that plan and what the land was designated as. So we're looking for things obviously like greenbelt, we're looking at local space designations, we're looking at policy designations, we're looking at housing requirements if it's a housing application, we're looking at housing policies, we're looking at affordable housing policies, things like that. But the local plan is a rich source of information, and most local plans are now interactive and online, and you can glean that information fairly readily. We also need to know what the status of the local plan is and whether it's been adopted recently, whether it's been in some form of formulation at some regulation stage, what is the status of the existing local plan, and what is the direction of travel of the local plan. We also have other important policy indicators. The National Planning Policy Framework, which is been revised now, it's been revised for a fourth time, but that's provides us with a national policy context which is used to formulate the local plan, but there are also pointers in national policy that may be at variance with local policies. So we would look at the National Planning Policy Framework and the context of environmental policies that are in there and development policies that are in there. We'd also look if there's a neighbourhood plan, because neighbourhood plan might be relevant. A neighbourhood plan might have status that supersedes the local plan. It might too have designations in there that we'd like to look at. The next thing we probably look at, very important at the moment, well, always important, is flooding, the context of flooding. And we're not just looking at flooding from rivers and seas, which is more important, but we're also looking at surface water flooding. Now, it's not always that this can't be mitigated, but it's a good starting point, certainly looking at the higher level flood zones. Sometimes these are very obvious. We know that they exist because the land is in a valley, a river valley or something like that. Sometimes it's very obvious it's not going to be relevant because the land is on a hill. But we would always look at the flooding context, and again, that's fairly readily available. Then we would go on to look at environmental designations, things like sites of special scientific interest, AONB, particularly in Staffordshire. Cannock Chase Sack is very important, and there's a policy context to Cannock Chase Sack that if you're in a certain distance of the Sack, which is a European habitat designation, then there'll be contributions that are required to mitigate impacts on it. So we would look at all the environmental designations. We'd also then look at the historic environment. These are not all necessarily in order, but we'd look at the historic environment. So we're looking for things like the presence of ancient monuments, listed buildings, conservation areas, things that would have an impact or that we have to mitigate in terms of the historic environment. So conservation areas probably at the top of the tree. If the land is impacted by a conservation area, we'd be aware of that. We'd also look at minerals and waste issues. So, for example, in Staffordshire, a lot of land is impacted by a safeguarding for sand and gravel. Much of the county is impacted by sand and gravel resource. There's other more important minerals such as Etruria Marl to the north of the county. There's various other minerals that might be relevant. Now, minerals don't usually mean that is going to stop development, but it means it might need to be taken out before development can commence. So it can be an important consideration. We would look at rights of way, public footpaths. They can impact on development, especially if they're running across the land in question or are close by. They might need to be set aside. We might need to undertake an application in parallel with an application to set aside a right of way or move a right of way. Again, not necessarily in order. We'd look at highways and we'd look at the access arrangements. So particularly important is how the site is accessed, what is the immediate impact or what is the immediate effect of the road network, how do we get into the site, can we provide a visibility display onto the road, what are the traffic implications, what's the traffic like in that area. Again, there's much data available to assist us on that before we got onto a more detailed study. We'd also look at things like the topography of the site. What level is it on? How might the site be developed in terms of its topographical nature? Is that going to be a constraint? Is it going to be an asset to development? We'd look at landscape designation. The landscape in Staffordshire has all been given a policy objective. This relates to quite an historic policy in the old structure plan, the old county structure plan, and most of the authorities in Staffordshire have adopted that designation. There are other landscape designations, the historic landscape designations that might be relevant. There's even farm landscape designations that might be relevant, all readily available and there to look at with an informed eye. We'd also look further at issues that might be underground. Now, some of Staffordshire, or the north of Staffordshire, particularly most of North Staffordshire and Stoke in fact, is impacted by deep mined coal or coal resources of all sorts, surface mined coal, deep mined coal. Information on that again is readily available with interpretation, and once we've got a certain amount of information we would maybe look further at an assessment, particularly if it's in North Staffordshire. But that information is readily available. There's also, from the British Geographical Survey, borehole information. That's readily available. It's quite fascinating in some cases. Every time any utility company or anyone puts a borehole into the ground, that information is recorded and given to the British Geological Survey and is readily available to anybody who needs to know what is going on underground. And one of the last things, or maybe it's not always the last thing, it depends on the nature of the land that we're dealing with and the application we're going to be putting in, is we like to look at the historic context. So along with the historic environment check and things like historic policy designations, we also like to look at as much old mapping information that we can find to establish the historic use of the site, if it's been built on, if it's likely to have been contaminated, if it's got any structures that might be relevant and so on. So there are about 10 or 11 points, issues that we would thoroughly examine before beginning to consider putting in a planning application anywhere. I hope that's helpful. Thanks.